Hafa and welcome to this series about ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia. These episodes introduce the latest research and discussions about ancient life, history, and cultural traditions all across our diverse region of Micronesia. I hope that you like this series, and I look forward to learning more together. When considering the ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia or of any region in the world, many people engage with their culture, history, and language in close connection with the landscapes where they live. In these respects, cultural landscapes are the places where people learn, experience, and create diverse aspects of their personal lives and cultural heritage. Some of these aspects are highly personalized for individual people, while other aspects could be shared among groups of people and could develop through multiple generations. Examples of cultural landscapes have been known throughout the world. Within the region of Micronesia, Dr. Boyd Dixon has been studying cultural landscapes, and here he shares some of the examples in Guam.
Cultural landscapes were first defined by the 20th century geographer Carl Sauer, and not surprisingly, he defined them as a landscape fashioned from a natural landscape by a cultural group. So that seems pretty simple for us to apply to almost every corner of Guam, as you could see on that map there. The first one is perhaps the earliest cultural landscape that is recognized today on Guam. The Fua Rock in Fuha Bay, and then Mount Tizon in Barrigada from Atacao Elementary there. And the creation legend of the island features both these prominent landmarks. And Lasso de Fua is the brother at Fua Rock on the southwest coast, and that is associated with his sister, Fu'una, who created our universe. And Tizon is the brother's stomach at Barrigada Hill. So the Texan landscape at the Retidian Wildlife Refuge is also somewhere that I assume many people recognize these days as a cultural landscape. The cliffs of the Texan would probably have been visible for miles at sea on a clear day, so that they would have been remembered by songs or stories or maybe navigational chants at night for people returning to their village. The rock art there is by Andrea Halandoni. The next image is courtesy of Mike Carson, and it's the Talofofo River mangrove landscape as one gets either gets on board or gets off at the valley of Laddie Village. Some Laddie people chose to live close to Talofofo Bay and its riverine landscape back along the sides of the valley, where they could set up their houses and farm the marshy land, maybe with taro and rice, and raise fish in large ponds, probably similar to what we see today for the fiestas that they all celebrated then, as we do today too. The next one we'll jump to is Gadao Cave, the landscape that one sees out of the window of the door of the cave itself, and look across to Inalahan and that side of the bay. There is a story about a rowing competition in one canoe between two powerful chiefs near the cave, and the story goes that they both got in both two ends of the canoe and paddled like crazy until the canoe split open. And that is, it's often considered a lesson for us to be more humble and more thoughtful of the land and the ocean that support the growing families. And Asia Regis is recording the rock art in that picture. The next place we will jump to is the Flores Library in Hagåtña. And that photo, the boy who jumped from Guam to Rota, it's about a powerful son who is escaping his angry father. And it's a story that is also associated with something similar at Gadao Cave, but the father watched his boy rip up a coconut tree from the ground to catch a crab or two, And when the dad got angry because he thought he was the strongest chief in the land there, the boy became afraid of his dad's anger and ran off the cliffs of Hinapsan, which is just down the road from Litexen, and leaped all the way to Luta, to Rota, where his mother's family still welcomes me today, I think. The next slide would be of Umatac Bay and the coastal landscape that you can see from Spanish Fort Soledad. And after Magellan first sighted Guam, after weeks at sea, the galleon became a yearly event to people in Umatac and neighboring villages. The fort was built across the bay to guard from pirates and other interlopers from Europe mostly. And the Santo Dionisio Church was built to serve a growing community. And the ruins of that church in its earlier form are being excavated by Sandra Monton Subias and a lot of the kids from Umatac village there in an archaeological project. The next photo is of the Spanish Plaza de España in Hagåtña, and there we all see every week when we drive through town, I dare say, the Spanish aspects of Hagåtña with the cathedral and basilica and the plaza where structures were and still are used for festivities and entertainment. And there were at one time various schools for children, and it is not unsimilar, I suppose, to what one would have seen in the late 1800s. So the next one is a landscape that probably we've all been to either as kids or when we first came to Guam. I think I was taken there. The Dos Amante cliff line and the seascape you see from the top are unforgettable, admittedly. And the two lovers that are referred to were a Chamorita girl and a young Spanish soldier boy, perhaps, who was who felt that they deserved to be married, and yet her family thought, no, this isn't appropriate, and for them to marry, and the two sealed their vows by falling off the cliffs there. And today that story can be read in any number of ways, I suppose, but it can be read as an allegory about the challenges of cross-cultural marriage and their consequences, which are with us today, as they were back then. So the next couple photos are of Hagåtña Bay in 1938, which would be not too long before World War II started, and the city of Hagåtña today from Fort Santa Agueda. In 1938, Hagåtña remained the capital of island industry with lots of government buildings and religious schools and homes and businesses. And you can see in that black and white power plant smokestack that Vic Torres has identified for us, that's part of where most of the landscape in either direction today is high rises. So, and the next one then is the Sumai Cemetery in the historic village landscape. And while you can't really see much of the built landscape there today when you are at the Sumai Cemetery, you can go see photos of it on the wall of Sumai Palas on Cross Island Road. There's some beautiful old photos there. From before World War II, Chamorro families would come home from church and stop and say hi to their loved ones at the cemetery, just as we still do today. And the village of Sumai slowly became connected with the rest of the world, or probably not even that slowly, when the Marine Corps had what was termed the Pan American Airways Clipper channel built in order to fly in daily from Hawaii or from China on a return flight, perhaps. The next one is something I've only become aware of more recently in its complexity, but the cultural landscapes of World War II can be seen symbolically, at least at Adelup, and you can see there that there's the Latte of Freedom that we all know that is much later in time, and for that matter, the Jinja Shrine, the Japanese shrine there, is relatively recent, but in anticipation of the Japanese invasion, the U.S. ordered the evacuation of military dependents in 1941, and Chamorros with access to a radio began to prepare their lanchos in nearby caves to hide in. And some of the settings we know, such as Fonte Plateau and Assen Beach, became a scene of much struggle, both in 1941 when the Japanese landed, and then again in 1944 when the Americans landed. So then we can jump up to Nimitz Hill and the top of the Mar there, which is, well, after 80 years of peace and prosperity on our island here, some people still refer to Guam as the tip of the spear, and this metaphor I find more likely to apply today to Nimitz Hill and the top of the Mar area, and that officers' club was built in 1949, so it's post-war, but not by a lot. And then, but with war came peace, so we also have the Guam Congress building in Hagåtña that was built in 1949, and that's just before the Guam Organic Act was signed in 1950. So perhaps the last landscape I've conjectured myself here is the University of Guam, which was opened in 1952 when I was born, and has arguably been a cultural landscape for several generations of students and faculty and friends of mine. And even more recently, the University of Guam Cultural Repository has been built to house collection from archaeological investigations over the last, well over 50 years at this point. And those photos are courtesy of Kelly Marsh, of course. So the last slide I have here is really a question for those of you watching. Are all of these photos and landscapes I just showed you really cultural landscapes on Guam? I define cultural landscapes myself by those landscapes of the past that help embody the memories that serve to teach the next generations about their future, including some of you watching this. Cultural landscapes also help tell stories and preserve memories from when we were young, like the school children that you see going to the Texan on school trips, and those of us that go down there on the weekend to play and or to look for amot or to visit caves and their rock art. And then some of us may not agree with every interpretation here of what is or isn't a particular cultural landscape, but that's fine, because they'll probably find some of their own, like when one drives down Marine Drive at any length and you look up over the hills and you think that you perhaps remember that your grandparents told you about an event that happened here at the end of the war, or they told you about an even older story that they were aware of. So realistically, it's the uniqueness of these landscapes that remains an integral expression of the land of the Chamorro, or Tanui Man Chamorro. Thank you very much, or Saina Masi.
Based on Dr. Boyd Dixon's presentation about cultural landscapes, I asked 3 questions to clarify and expand. Question 1. What distinguishes a cultural landscape apart from an archaeological landscape?
Well, we've already talked earlier about the an earlier definition of the cultural landscapes being nothing more than a landscape that's had cultural impacts or presence. I think that archaeological sites, at least to define first, are fairly self-evident that we all recognize latticettes and lusangs when we're in the field or in the jungles. And I think probably some of us have been to cave paintings in Retidian or seen pottery scatter where our grandma's digging in the backyard planting a new bed of roses or something. What's important here is to juxtapose or compare with landscapes. I guess by my definition again, they often tend to be prominent pieces of the view plane when you're either driving down Marine Drive or looking off my balcony here, or maybe visiting one of your favorite beachscapes. Cultural landscapes historically have also been recorded by various artists like Arago, who came here in 1819 with Freycinet, and seemed to also to draw and then paint places that he considered either interesting or provocative, I suppose. I know we have paintings from Hagatna, from a shipboard, and also of Apra Harbor, and he's done a few things in town, in Hagatna at the time, and maybe roadsides in Assen or other places.
Question 2. How can people know that a place is or is not a cultural landscape?
In identifying cultural landscapes, I would say when I first started working in the Marianas 25 years ago, I was constantly amazed by new and different landforms and jungle and trees and rock outcrops and cliffs. And it wasn't till I spent a little more time working with all the Samodu and other folks that were helping me in the field that I began to realize they were telling me, now, Boyd, you apologize before you pee over here. And see that big nunu tree over there? I wouldn't recommend going over there for lunch if you paid me. And they would tell you stories about Tautalmona or events that had happened that their grandparents told them happens every time you go by this one place on the way through from Ipan to Talafofo, for instance. We archaeologists, I don't think, are overly trained to recognize a cultural landscape. It's something that has to be defined by those of us that live in a place, in a landscape for a while. There are places that you may feel mahalang for, and you're gone for a long time, and you, no matter how much fun you may be having in Las Vegas or New York City, you still remember certain things when you're just lying in bed or walking around outside that remind you of that place in Guam. And these could be favorite fishing holes and hunting spots that probably you haven't shared with anybody, but maybe one good friend, you know. Maybe where you had your first kiss, or where you found your first dog, or where your family's gravesite has been for decades or generations. Those kind of things probably emit a sense of cultural landscapes to us as individuals, but we would be hard pressed to ever say that there are formal cultural landscapes for the general public. You know, they're meant to be personal. This is the way I look at it.
Question 3. What could be the future of learning more about cultural landscapes?
I realize that I'm no expert in this, surely, you know, that it takes many people, many generations perhaps to decide what is a cultural landscape. And I dare say that some of them that appeared to be so before World War II probably are not considered anywhere near as prominent these days. And other places that I haven't mentioned, surely there's many that are in all these islands.
I should clarify that cultural landscapes always coincide with recognizable places or landmarks. The exact points or mapped boundaries could be interpreted differently, but the general parameters always can be recognized and depicted, at least vaguely, on a map. The meaning or significance of a cultural landscape could be variable from one person to another, as well as from one generation to another. As presented here, a cultural landscape could be any place where people can engage with aspects of their culture, history, and language. Some of the best known examples are the places with traditional cultural place names. Often, these place names are linked with stories about what happened here in the past. Generally, as human beings, we all learn about the histories and traditions of the places where we live, work, and travel. In this way, we can learn about how certain landmarks and landscapes came to exist, and we can learn about how people can or should live or behave. The histories, lessons, and traditions continue from one generation to the next, inevitably with some amount of variation and interpretation. Typically, the traditions can continue with the most stability when they can be shared and experienced through the same language of their origin. Many of the elements, especially about place names and traditions, make the most sense only within their original language. The interrelations of culture, history, and language can be extensive and profound in the context of cultural landscapes. Many cultural landscapes happen to overlap with archaeological sites or landscapes. One example is Gadao's Cave in Guam. Gadao has been a famous figure in indigenous Chamorro traditions of Guam, often associated with displays of strength or competitions involving strength. Gadao's actions in these stories could represent behaviors to be emulated or to be avoided. Gadao's Cave is a permanently fixed landmark. The archaeological components include the grinding basins or lusong that were carved into an ancient tidal notch along the shoreline, as well as the famous white pigment line drawings of pictographs inside the cave, all related to the traditional Lati period of about AD 1000 through 1700. In this case, the cultural traditions about Gadao and the archaeological evidence at the cave are not necessarily related with each other, but these two perspectives about the place can work together when experiencing the landscape. Some but not all cultural landscapes happen to include material archaeological layers about how a landscape has changed through time. One example is at Litekten or Ritidian, currently within the Guam National Wildlife Refuge, where the archaeological record extends back all the way to the time when people first ever lived in the region, at least as early as 1500 BC. Archaeological research has shown how the physical landforms, coastal ecology, and freshwater resources have changed through time, and how people have created different housing patterns, rock art in caves, and assortments of pottery, other artifacts, and food middens within each separate time period. In other words, the natural history and the cultural history have been coordinated together for a holistic understanding of landscape evolution, now included as part of the experience of people who visit the place with the self-guided tours or with the official guided tours by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. All of these aspects contribute to the knowledge of the archaeological landscape and the experience of the cultural landscape. As I mentioned near the beginning of this episode, cultural landscapes have been known throughout the world, formally and informally. Often, they have been difficult to commit into permanent written records, yet they remain meaningful and significant. What places would you recognize as cultural landscapes? How do these places relate with aspects of culture, history, and language?
Thank you for joining us in learning about ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia. If you would like to learn more details, then I encourage you to visit, in person or online, the Micronesian Area Research Center of the University of Guam. Thank you again for watching this program. I hope that you will continue to explore and discover more.